Hey everybody, we're back for part 4 in this video in our study of the American Dream and the Great Gatsby. If you can read it, you don't have to read it to do these lessons. The supplemental materials are completely independent. They're picked out simply as a way to bolster the themes in the chapters. All right, so now we're going to talk about a guy named Frank Abagnale. If you saw the last video on chapter 3 in the way Nick thought about Jordan and the way Jordan was, what kind of person she was, then you'll remember here that I mentioned Frank Abagnale. Frank Abagnale was basically a con artist, a counterfeiter who made untold fortunes being a con artist. Basically, a con artist is somebody who cons people. You should all know what that term means. And so in this article, this is about Frank Abagnale, and basically who he was he conned people for years in order to gain money and power. Although he was caught and he was sentenced to prison, he was released after just 5 years in order to help the FBI identify other cases of fraud. And he went on in most of the technologies that we have now and the ways that they identify thieves at the FBI were the things that Abagnale told them and put in place. So the reason why I picked this text is because it provides insight into the workings of what a con artist is. I give it after we read chapter 4 of Gatsby because in chapter 4, Nick and Gatsby take a ride into New York for lunch. And this text basically, when you read it, I want you to consider how Nick wavers in his trust of Gatsby. He doesn't trust him. He doesn't think that he's telling the truth. He thinks there's something shady about him. And so think about it. If you read chapter 4, and if you didn't, you don't have to do this because you can read the article anyway. But if you've read it, how do you think Gatsby's stories shape what Nick thinks about him? And how does Gatsby's mysterious past and his association with Wolfshiem? Wolfshiem is an interesting character, and I really, really hope that you get to read the book if you haven't. He's very mysterious, and he comes across as somebody who's not exactly on the up and up. He's got a bit of criminal in him. How does this all help shape Nick's views? All right, so let's read our article. All right, so our article is on Frank Abagnale. Here's this introduction. Frank Abagnale lived a life of deception, conning people for years in order to gain money and power. He was eventually caught and arrested. He only had to serve 5 years before the FBI decided to let him out early to help him identify other cases of fraud. All right, so here this just gives background of who he was. You should have already read all of this. Talks about how his father came into some money problems and where he first started out. All right, now there is a movie called Catch Me If You Can, based upon a book that this Abagnale guy wrote, and he tells his story, and he starts off, forging checks, basically, forging checks. And I know a lot of you are young, and you may not really remember what checks are, but there are a lot of safeguards in place now to where you can't do things like this, or it's much more difficult to do things like this, but it was very easy back in the day, apparently. He became very skilled over time, devised a variety of schemes for defrauding banks. And then he got more and more and more. He had to go on the run because the FBI started investigating him and came looking for him because he ended up at the time when they first started looking for him, he had amassed over $1 million in forged checks and all kinds of stuff like that. And I don't know the exact conversion rate, but $1 million back during this time was considerably more than what $1 million is today. In the movie that they made about this guy, Leonardo DiCaprio played Abagnale, and his schemes, you'll watch the movie and you'll think, there's no way this dude could do all this, but he did. He ended up impersonating a pilot for Pan Am and flew flights and all kinds of stuff like that. Right here, Pan Am estimated that between the ages of 16 and 18. This guy was 16 and 18. This wasn't a 30-year-old person or anything. This was a young person. This was a guy in high school, like a sophomore or junior in high school, right there, 16. Abagnale flew on over 250 flights to 26 countries with his false pilot ID. He also stayed at hotels and ate most of his meal billed to the airline during these days. He was unbelievably ruthless in this. Now, this to go back to what we talked about in the previous video about quote unquote victimless crimes. He's not hurting anybody right here off the top of his head. He's not like committing a robbery. He's not murdering anybody. He looks at this as a victimless crime. Down here, he assumed the identity of a doctor for nearly a year. Impersonated a chief resident in a Georgia hospital. The guy was unbelievable. Then he was a lawyer. He pursued this career as a lawyer, did the exact same thing. Eventually, he was caught in France in 1969. He went to jail for 5 years, and then right here, he made a deal with the government, and he ended up helping them investigate fraud. Right here, since his release from prison, Abagnale has also appeared in a number of TV shows as a celebrity con man. In 1980, Abagnale wrote the book Catch Me If You Can, to which was made into the Academy Award-nominated movie, directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Why do you think he did this? How much does this relate back to our previous video on a cheater's high? According to the movie, and I haven't read the book, but Abagnale didn't think he was doing anything wrong. By all accounts, he was a good guy. He didn't hurt anything. He didn't hurt anybody. But he was doing these seriously illegal activities. Why? What makes seemingly good people do bad things? What makes people that kind of raised up in good families and a good environment do bad things? Environment doesn't necessarily lead to good or bad. Environment just is. All right, here are our questions. Number one of the central ideas of the text is that Abagnale was able to assume multiple identities as a con artist. What is another idea that is central to the text? The answer to number one is D. Abagnale was eventually able to utilize his skills as a former con artist on the other side of the law to his own legal success. So, if you are a police officer or an investigator and you're trying to get inside the head and figure out how criminals operate, who better than a criminal to help you do that? And that's what he ended up doing. He turned over a new leaf, and he ended up helping put a stop to things like he was doing. Number two, this is how they ask you vocabulary questions on the EOC and on the ACT. They don't ask you to give a straight definition. They ask you for synonyms. What does the word liable most closely mean as it is used in paragraph 2? The answer is B, responsible. Liable for. If you are liable for something, you are responsible for something. Number 3, reread the beginning of paragraph 5. The author describes another of Abagnale's false identities as ambitious. How does this word choice develop this audience's sense view of Abagnale? The answer to this one is D. It presents Abagnale as motivated, though perhaps reckless, given the context of his ambition. This is when paragraph 5 is when he says he assumed the identity of a doctor. This is serious right here, okay? This is taking people's lives into his hand, all right? Even though he said as a supervisor he was not expected to do any real medical work, he still could have seriously affected some people's lives. He left the hospital after several close call incidents in which he realized he could put lives at risk because of his lack of medical expertise. All right, number 4, which of the following statements best describes how Abagnale was able to impersonate several identities so convincingly? Number 4, the answer is A. He expertly forged IDs and credentials, fake IDs. People didn't check back then. The world of the 1950s and 60s was unlike anything that you can imagine today. Now, I'm not that old. I didn't live during them, but I've read a lot, and I've seen a lot of movies, and I know that people did not suspect people to be the way that they really are. They didn't look and see. And also, we didn't have the technology, the means of protecting things like we do now. Number 5, How did Abagnale change, if at all, after his 5-year prison stay? Well, it says support your answer. You'd have to go in and do it yourself. But basically, it looks like he turned over a new leaf. He went from doing wrong to preventing wrong. All right, these down here, these are your opinions. For nearly a year, Abagnale called himself a doctor, but he didn't do the work that is required of a doctor. Why would Abagnale choose to impersonate this particular profession if he didn't intend to do the work required of it? Being a doctor has a certain level of prestige to it and a good salary. Even today, it has a very high level of prestige and a good salary. Back then, it had an even higher level of prestige. Number 2, do you think it was right decision to release Abagnale from prison after his 5-year stay? Consider the government's reason for releasing Abagnale. That's up to you. Do you think they should have kept him in jail and kept punishing him? Or should they let him out to do the stuff he was doing? Is another punishment keeping him from doing what he was doing and making him find other people who were doing it? That's up to you. What makes you who you are? Your actions, the way others see you, or the way you see yourself? What makes up a person's identity? What makes you the person you are? Your beliefs? Your family? What's the most important thing to being who you are? That was part 4 in our American Dream supplemental lessons. What makes you who you are? Why do people do the things they do? Are some crimes truly victimless? And does that make them okay? These are all moral and ethical questions. There's no right or wrong. There's gray. Not black and white, shades of gray. The next lesson, the 5th and final one for the week, will be about a poem. We're actually going to get into some poetry. And a lot of people don't like poetry, but poetry is music. It's music without, it's lyrics without music to it. Till I see you again, be safe. It's a great day to be a warrior.